Thank you so much, JJ and Andy and Heather. And it's a pleasure to how can I put it, be in Monroe virtually, considering that it is the heart of some of Tecumseh's greatest martial achievements during the War of 1812. I should say, just by way of a footnote, since JJ was talking about the River Raisin, that Tecumseh was not at the River Raisin. He actually was ill during that time and missed the battle. So one can only speculate how things might have turned out had he been present. Well, tonight, what I'd like to do is talk about the general thrust of my book, Tecumseh and the Prophet, give you kind of an overview of what I tried to achieve in the book. And then we'll take a look at the Detroit campaign of 1812, which of course was one of the most significant campaigns of the War of 1812. And then I want to conclude my formal remarks with a question, which I would have thought before I began the book would have been rhetorical, but now is a real question. That is, could the Shawnee brothers have succeeded in their endeavor to create a permanent Indian homeland in the upper Midwest? And then I'll close with a short reading from the book that pertains to early Detroit that I thought might be of interest to you folks from Michigan. Well, of course, when people think of the Indian Wars or of iconic Indian leaders, there's inevitably a tendency to look to the American West. I think we here today are among the exception in realizing that the bloodiest and most decisive conflicts between Native Americans and their British allies and encroaching white settlers occurred in what is today the Midwest between 1791 and 1813. Those battles, the battles in the American West pale beside the conflicts that occurred in the modern Midwest. By way of example, of course, in 1791, nearly the entire United States Army, such as it was wiped out in a single battle in Indiana, known as St. Clair's defeat. It actually took most of the federal budget at the time to finally defeat the Allied Midwestern tribes at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. Now, just 10 years after that, at the dawn of the 19th century, Indian society in the Midwest was in shambles. The tribes had been swindled out of vast tracts of land in Ohio, Illinois, southern Indiana, and even a slice of Michigan, including most of modern Ohio. They were fragmented, spiritually bereft shells of their former selves. Only a generation earlier, the entire region, the entire Midwest had been Indian country. By 1805, however, land encroachment, poverty, disease, anguish, and alcoholism appeared to be the Indians' fate. And then the Shawnee chief Tecumseh and his younger brother, the prophet Tenskwatawa, emerged to restore Indian dignity and unity of purpose. They joined with the British. I think we're up for slide 2. I don't see it on the screen. They joined with the British in the War of 1812 and came desperately close to changing the course of American history, reshaping the nation's northern boundary, and potentially arresting for a generation, or perhaps more, the tide of Western expansion. In the slide we see here, that's Tecumseh holding the musket. That's a painting by a very close friend of mine, Keith Rocco, a well-known historical artist. And beside him is a little-known sketch, I shouldn't say sketch, watercolor rendering of Tecumseh, um, done in the 1830s. But Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa were the co-architects of the greatest pan-Indian confederation the Western American Republic would ever confront. Their movement, to put it in perspective, encompassed nearly half of what was then the United States, from the icy upper reaches of the Mississippi River to the steamy bottomlands of the Alabama River. No other Indian leaders in American history would enjoy such a broad appeal, and none would ever pose a graver threat to American expansion than did Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. At the height of their appeal, the Shawnee brothers, again, to put things in perspective, in comparison with the West, at the height of their appeal during the War of 1812, the Shawnee brothers mustered 2.5 times as many warriors as would Chief Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse on the Little Bighorn River some 3 generations later. And of course, that represented the apex of Indian resistance in the American West. So Tecumseh and his brother mustered nearly 3 times as many warriors at the peak of their alliance. So one question that I think naturally comes to mind, and was a principal question in my mind as I began working on this book is why has the memory of Tecumseh prospered over time while his brother has been, or I should say had been prior to my book, if I may say so, all but relegated to the dustbin of history. And the reasons for this became obvious to me in the course of my work. Tecumseh would, after his death and in life, come to personify for Americans, both of his day and subsequently, all that was great and noble in the Native American character as whites perceived greatness and nobility. Tecumseh advocated a political and military alliance of Indian tribes, which was expanded to include the British in the War of 1812, in order to oppose United States encroachment on Indian land. Now, this was something that whites of the time could readily comprehend. Tecumseh, who was first and foremost a political leader, acted as they would have acted under similar circumstances. Tenskwatawa, on the other hand, offered a divinely inspired solution to Indian land dispossession and cultural disillusion that drew on native traditions which were beyond white understanding. Tenskwatawa's aspect also repulsed whites. It's not so obvious from this painting of Tenskwatawa that we see on the screen, which is actually, I think, quite flattering and perhaps the most realistic image of him. But he was a rather unappealing figure. He was an ex-alcoholic who, as a boy, had accidentally shot his right eye out with an arrow. He was, to quote an Indian agent who knew both the brothers, a man devoid of talent or merit, a brawling, mischievous Indian demagogue. The same official admired Tecumseh as the exemplar of Shawnee manhood, a skilled warrior and a skilled hunter and a cunning war leader, charitable and an orator of rare eloquence. In a similar manner, history, biography, and folklore all came to deify Tecumseh and to demonize his brother as a delusional charlatan. My book, Tecumseh and the Prophet, I would argue, is the first work to give Tenskwatawa adequate credit for his role not only in creating, but also in sustaining the most potent Indian confederacy the US would ever confront. And in the book, I hope to make readers appreciate the nativist religious fervor that contributed to the emergence of Tenskwatawa and which he shaped into a coherent and compelling doctrine. So what I've attempted to do in the book is to redress what I consider to have been the gross imbalance in the historical perception of the Shawnee brothers. Simply put, without Tenskwatawa, there would have been no Tecumseh. That, in essence, is the thrust of my book in broad terms. A book that deals not only with the lives of the preeminent Indian political and war leader in US history, and his brother, the most influential Indian spiritual leader, but also the larger story of the struggle for America's heartland. And in this, my narrative reaches back to the mid-18th century, through the War of 1812 and beyond, to ultimately to the expulsion of the Shawnees from Ohio in the 1830s. So I'd like to examine now briefly Tecumseh's first display of his deep military talents just before and during the siege and battle of Detroit in the summer of 1812. I'll give you a second to take a look at the map here and orient yourselves to Detroit in the upper portion of the map. And just south of Detroit at the opening of the Detroit River onto Lake Erie, we see Amherstburg and Fort Malden in what was then called the Western District of British Upper Canada. So prior to the War of 1812, Tecumseh's sole military experience had been as a minor war leader against Kentucky and Tennessee militia, and subsequently at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. In June 1812, Tecumseh left Tenskwatawa and their intertribal village headquarters at Prophetstown in Indiana on the Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers, and set off for Fort Malden to confer with British authorities and to seek arms and ammunition for defensive purposes. Now, he was completely unaware when he set off from Prophetstown that the United States had declared war on Great Britain, that the war had actually begun, or that the taming of the hostile savages, so to speak, of the Old Northwest, meaning Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa's alliance, was one of the reasons the Madison administration gave for declaring war on Great Britain. They assumed that the Indians were mere British lackeys in the war. Now, the Madison administration had taken no real steps to prepare for war with Great Britain, beside a badly managed mobilization in the early months of 1812 preceding the war, but it could not ignore one vitally important point, and that was Detroit. Detroit was, slide please. Detroit was the key to what was then called the Northern Country. It was, of course, a relatively remote settlement of merely 1,200 residents within cannon shot of British territory. Here in this slide, you see a schematic of Fort Detroit. There are no really good extant pictures, at least not that I'm aware of Fort Detroit, but this is a very accurate schematic. Fort Malden, the hive around which hundreds of hostile Indians then buzzed, lay just 20 miles downriver from Detroit on the east bank of the Detroit River and was garrisoned by at least 300 redcoats and roughly an equal number of marginally reliable Canadian militiamen. Now, by contrast, only 94 Americans garrisoned Fort Detroit. The only other American military post in Michigan was Fort Michilimackinac, and the entire population of the Michigan Territory was fewer than 5,000 people, of whom some 4/5 were French Canadians of questionable allegiance to the United States. Outside of Detroit, in modern day Monroe Township and elsewhere south of the city, loyal, that is to say, pro-American residents warned that, as one put it, every individual house is a frontier. No one farm is covered by another farm in the rear of it. In other words, they would be easy prey for warring Indians. So in order to secure Detroit and its environs and to invade Upper Canada, which was one of the goals of the Madison administration, the administration chose the governor of the territory, William Hull, to lead the military effort. Here we see a picture of Governor turned General William Hull, along with the only, if you could go back, please, along with the only, as far as I know, the only extant portion of what came to be known as Hull's Trace, the road he took from northern Ohio to Detroit, that still exists. And I believe, JJ, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's not too far from where you folks are. So in June 1812, with a 2,500-man army consisting mostly of Ohio volunteers, Hull marched up what became known as Hull's Trace to Detroit. He secured the settlement easily, but then he waffled. He was unsure what to do. The British commander at Fort Malden likewise was at a loss what to do. His Canadian militia were deserting in droves, more interested in farming than in making war on the Americans. And then in June of 1812, at the height of British paralysis, Tecumseh appears on the scene. He brought order to the Indians who were milling about and then took it upon him. If we could go back on the slide, please. Thank you. And then took it upon himself to reinforce a thin British line along the Canard River that was resisting probes by Hull's advance guard, which had crossed the Detroit River near Sandwich, more or less directly across from Fort Detroit. So while the British commander at Fort Malden was at a loss what to do beyond skirmish along the Canard River line, Tecumseh took it upon himself to actually venture forth and ambush Hull's vanguard with 150 warriors. He scattered the Americans and so unnerved General Hull that Hull actually canceled his planned invasion of Canada because of Tecumseh's aggressive ambush of his vanguard. Now, a new and a more aggressive British commander, Colonel Henry Proctor, seen here in this slide, arrived shortly thereafter on the scene with much needed reinforcements. Now, Proctor and Tecumseh hit it off nicely. Having stopped the invasion, Tecumseh worked in concert with Proctor to isolate Hull in Detroit. Now, Hull depended on a tenuous supply line back southward along Hull's Trace to northern Ohio. He had made no provision to defend his supply line. And an egregious miscalculation by any commander to ignore his supply line. Instead, what he did was he bought off the Indians who were resident in the area, the Michigan Wyandots. He bought them off largely with gold in order to ensure the integrity of his rear area. Here we see a nice, rather stylized painting of the Wyandots, who were a fascinating tribe. They were a band of Hurons, a band from the once great Huron nation, who had immigrated from Canada into what is today southern Michigan and northern Ohio after the Iroquois defeated the Huron Confederacy in the 1600s. They were a small tribe. They numbered only about 1,200 members, and they were divided into three bands. There was a pro-American band in northern Ohio on the southern shores of Lake Erie, a small pro-British band across the Detroit River near Amherstburg, and the neutral Michigan or Detroit River Wyandots, who lived in two principal settlements not far from Monroe, Brownstown and Mongwagon, also known as Magwaga. Despite their small numbers, the Michigan Wyandots enjoyed tremendous prestige. They lived in prosperous communities and farms, not unlike in many cases their white neighbors. Many of them had been converted to Catholicism. And because of the prestige that they enjoyed, having once been part of the Great Huron Confederacy, they were keepers of what was called the Great Wampum Belt, which symbolized the alliance among tribes of the upper Midwest. And Brownstown, which was, again, one of the two principal settlements of the Michigan Wyandots, was the seat of what was called the Great Fire, or the periodic intertribal councils that occurred. Now, Tecumseh realized that if he could convince the Michigan Wyandots to defect to his alliance, which was then gathering around Amherstburg and Fort Malden, that Hull would not only find his supply line in jeopardy, but he would also face the prospect that tribes from further west, such as wavering members of the Potawatomi tribe, would follow the Wyandots as kindlers of the Great Fire into the British camp. So Tecumseh went to Brownstown to try to convince the Michigan Wyandots to switch sides. After 4 days of rancorous councils, at the end of each day's council, Tecumseh would take the symbolic peace pipe, break it in two, and throw it in the fire. After 4 days of this, he finally convinced the Michigan Wyandots to agree to come over to the British side. On August 3rd, 1812, losing no time, Tecumseh saw the Michigan Wyandots across the river, thus opening Hull's supply line to interdiction. At the very same time Tecumseh exposed Hull's supply lines, Hull received word that Fort Michilimackinac had fallen to a large Indian force. So he was hit by two setbacks simultaneously. Now, while the Michigan Wyandots paddle over to the east bank of the Detroit River. Tecumseh stayed behind astride Hull's lifeline with just 40 warriors. Just 40 warriors. And here we see a depiction of the principal combatants we'll be talking about. Here is a wonderful illustration, wonderful painting of a Shawnee warrior, an American regular, and a American militiaman or volunteer, which constituted the majority of the troops that Hull had under his command. On August 4th, a supply train from Ohio stopped at the River Raisin to await an escort from Fort Hull to bring provisions to the fort. The men in the garrison, the men of Hull's army, were already low on food. Hull, unaware that there were any Indians, hostile Indians on his supply lines, sent a 200-man column from Detroit to escort this supply convoy to Detroit. Now, Tecumseh, with just 40 warriors, and I go into this in detail in the book, with just 40 warriors, Tecumseh was able to ambush and thoroughly rout the 200-man column that Hull had sent to bring in the supply train. Tecumseh's victory stunned Hull. As one of Hull's staff officers wrote, "This little discomfiture divested him of all self-possession or control over his fears." Hull managed to regroup. He sent a second and larger detachment to rescue the supply train. Tecumseh planned another ambush at Monguagan, which you also see on the map here, in conjunction with British reinforcements. He was defeated, but only because the British botched their part in the battle. Again, I go into that in great detail in the book. Nevertheless, despite it being a tactical defeat for the Indians and the British, the Americans gained nothing by it. The American relief column did not proceed any further. Hull recalled it to Detroit, and the supply convoy was left on the River Raisin. Now, the actual Battle of Detroit was an anticlimax, really. I mean, Hull's fate was essentially sealed when Tecumseh closed his route of supply and isolated him. In early August, the commanding general in Western Canada, Sir Isaac Brock, decided to come to Amherstburg himself, along with additional reinforcements, to take charge of a counteroffensive against Hull and Fort Detroit. He and Brock hit it off beautifully. And on August 16th, their combined force crossed the river above Detroit at daybreak. 750 British and 600 Canadian militia and about 600 warriors crossed the river to confront Hull with 2,500 troops in a strong fort. Now, if you calculate the odds, they were about even, and Hull was behind the walls of a strong fort. I mean, that should have mitigated against an American defeat. And Hull, he initially refused the request from Brock to surrender Fort Detroit. But Hull had one great weakness. He was deathly afraid of Indians, particularly after Fort Michilimackinac fell. He wasn't sure if the warrior force that had taken Michilimackinac may have joined Tecumseh. He also had his wife and daughter and a large number of civilians in the fort. So he was very worried about the Indian threat and what would happen if the fort fell in battle to the Indians. Well, Tecumseh went to work on August 16th to deceive the Americans. While the British and Canadians formed their lines of battle on open ground before the fort, he shepherded his warriors into a forest west of Fort Detroit and then marched them 3 times through an opening in the timber in full view of the garrison, which led an astonished Hull to conclude that more than 2,000 Indians confronted him, in addition to the British and Canadian forces drawn up to his front. So, terrified of an Indian massacre, Tecumseh hoisted the white flag. Here we see Hull hoisting the white flag and him rather sheepishly surrendering to General Brock with a snickering Tecumseh looking on from behind. Just before the surrender, Brock asked Tecumseh to not abuse the prisoners, since oftentimes Indian warriors did slaughter American prisoners, to put it frankly, and that's what occurred subsequently at the River Raisin. Tecumseh told Brock, no, he said, I despise him too much to meddle with them, and he was true to his word. The fall of Detroit was of tremendous strategic importance. At that time in the War of 1812, it robbed the Midwestern theater of the war of its only mobile army. The British and Indians maintained control of Michigan for nearly a year. And the United States was on the defensive in that theater for nearly a year. As to what happened afterwards, I'll leave you to read Tecumseh and the Prophet to find out more. So with that, I want to conclude with the question, could Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa have achieved their goal of creating an Indian homeland in the modern Midwest? When I approached the topic, I kind of did so with the fatalistic perspective. I assumed that they were really foreordained to lose. In fact, in the course of my research, and I think you'll discover as you read the book, if you read the book, that there were a number of opportunities when things could have turned in their favor, and the British and Indians could have defeated the Americans, and Tecumseh and the Prophet realized their dream of Indian homeland. Now, the British had promised the Indians, promised Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa a buffer state, an Indian homeland, if they emerged victorious in the War of 1812, which would have served 2 purposes. It, of course, would have ensured and maintained the Indians' allegiance, and it would have offered a semi-permanent or perhaps permanent buffer between British Canada and the United States. And that buffer state would have consisted of modern Michigan and part of northernmost Ohio and perhaps part of northern Indiana as well. But the British lost, and one of the principal reasons why they lost was Napoleon Bonaparte. And I'll leave that hanging, and for you to understand better the reason why I say that if you read the book. I'd like to close now and open the floor to questions. I'd like to close now with just a brief reading from the book, that a portion that deals with Detroit. And we fast forward to the year 1824. Tecumseh is long dead. Tenskwatawa is living in exile, essentially, in British Canada. And Governor Lewis Cass of the Michigan Territory decides that it might be worthwhile to reach out to Tenskwatawa and try to enlist his support to help convince the Shawnee, then living in Ohio, to move west of the Mississippi River as part of a larger American effort to remove remaining Indians from the Midwest, west of the Mississippi River. So in December 1824, Governor Cass invites Tenskwatawa to visit him in Detroit. And here's where I'll take up from the book. Detroit had changed much since Tenskwatawa last visited the city 8 years earlier. No longer was it a lightly peopled, French-Canadian flavored foothold on the edge of the American frontier. The population had reached 2,000, making it the largest American community in which the Shawnee Prophet had ever set foot. Chiefs Little Turtle, Blackhoof, and Menpok had visited the populous and bustling cities of Baltimore and Philadelphia and the boisterous young capital of Washington, D.C. They had seen firsthand something of the millions of whites who thronged the Atlantic coast. But the latent power of the Americans had remained a mystery to the Shawnee brothers. The Americans of their world inhabited a hive of lonely farms, tiny settlements, and small towns hardly larger than Indian villages. Now, Tenskwatawa was getting a belated first taste of American urban